going to be talking about what is my in-progress book manuscript. So my work broadly focuses on how people use symbols in order to form community during periods of authoritarianism. So today we're going to be talking about 3 different periods of authoritarianism in Argentine history. So I've tried to lay it out broadly so that we have an idea that we can keep coming back to throughout the presentation. So the first period that I'll be talking about is 1966 and 1969. This was a period of one of the first major dictatorships of the 20th century in Argentina. The 20th century in Argentina is filled with dictatorships. So we will have several of these that we discuss. The second is kind of the second moment, 1972 to 1973, is sort of the tail end of the same dictatorship period. And the third period is 1976 and 1977, which is the beginning of what's known as the last military dictatorship in Argentina. Some other people might call it the process of national reorganization. You might have seen it referred to as the Dirty War in U.S. scholarship. I avoid that term because it sort of signals an equal relationship between militants and the military that pursued them. It's used in English, but not by most people in Spanish. So these are the 3 moments that we're going to keep coming back to, or that we'll sort of move through, and we'll come back to this at the end. So why is it important to talk about memorializations in Argentina? After the most recent military dictatorship, memory politics became actually part of politics in Argentina. So one of the ways that people performed memory politics in honor of the 30,000 people that had been disappeared, which means kidnapped and detained, often tortured, and not seen again, was through familiar means. And by familiar, I mean like of their family members. So here we have 2 of the most recognized familiar organizations. The well-known Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, or the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, who started walking around the main plaza in 1977 to protest the disappearance of their children. I haven't pictured here the abuelas, the grandmothers, who have also marched, but who have focused more on the recuperation of the sons and daughters of their disappeared sons and daughters. And then the hijos, which is a more recent group that became active after the end of the dictatorship. And these are the children that were recuperated or children of disappeared parents. So these are the 2 familiar mechanisms. There's also other kinds of non-familiar ways of remembering in the post-dictatorship period. So the siluetazos were an art project created by 3 artists, Rodolfo Aguberi, Julio Flores, and Guillermo Quexe. And it cites the construction de aso that we're going to talk a bit more about today. So this, we're going to talk about the Cordobazo. It basically means like kind of an uprising or a mobilization in some way. The project used outlines of individual live bodies to represent the bodies of the disappeared. And it carried the Madre support, but it was a vernacular collective memory practice that represented 2 divergent, a different kind of approach to memory. It wasn't based on biology. It wasn't based on the children of the mothers or the parents of the hijos. It was a way of putting in sort of nameless bodies to represent the names of the disappeared. And the other difference is, well, on the one hand, the Madres focused on recovering their children. The siluetazos focused more on sort of citing them as still alive or present in some way. The other way of non-familiar memory, even though you'll notice from the headscarf from Mother of the Plaza de Mayo there in the photo, was the Parque de la Memoria, which was the plans were conceived in 1998, and then it actually began construction in 2001. And the park is a sort of vast space along the river. They chose the site along the river because that's where the military would drop the bodies of the disappeared persons from helicopters or planes. And it's modernist in design, so there's a lot of sort of artwork, large sculptures, but the sort of centerpiece is what you see here, part of this wall that has the names of all of the known disappeared persons. It also includes empty spaces to signal the people that are not yet known to be disappeared. and it's sort of reminiscent of the Vietnam Memorial. It looks similar in scale and size and has the same idea of the sort of vast naming practices. In Argentina, memory practices continue to be political. So previous to the current president, the last two presidents were Nestor Kirchner and Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner. They were married. Nestor died in 2010. And the Kirchners sort of made memory practices and human rights in general in Argentina part of their political platform. So they became very closely linked to the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo. They used it as a way of garnering political support against the sort of oligarchical forces. They were part of this new populist left, so that fit with their sort of politics. And this means that sort of negotiations over memory politics in Argentina are still front and center. They're a way of signaling what kind of political affiliation you have, where you stand on the political spectrum. So in the case of Argentina, memory politics are still very active political. So I came to the project as a sort of way of figuring out how these memory practices came to be. What was the history of this history, basically? In what ways were memory practices or memorialization used prior to these post-1983 articulations of memory? So we're going to start in 1966. This is, as in all kinds of histories, this is sort of an artificial start date. There were dictatorships before. As I've already mentioned, there were dictatorships afterwards. But I chose this moment because it was the beginning of a series of rather similar dictatorships that alternated with authoritarian civilian rule. So in 1966, General Juan Carlos Onganía assumed power in a military coup d'etat. He unsat the seat of President Arturo Illia, who was democratically elected, but in an election that still foreclosed participation by some political groups, namely the Peronists. And he was installed as sort of a figure that would bring order to Argentina. The military saw him as a relatively moderate military leader, and they hoped that he would sort of settle down the economy, settle down the politics of Argentina. However, he soon prohibited all political activity in the country, so this didn't necessarily mean, some people have interpreted this to mean like you couldn't have a book, and it did end up kind of meaning that for some people, but this really meant initially that he didn't let people belong to political organizations. So you couldn't have a local neighborhood Peronist office building, basically. And he outlawed the display of sort of political names. So you couldn't write like Perón's name on the side of a building, for example. On July 29th, a little more than a month after he took power, the federal police engaged in a violent occupation of the public university. So in Buenos Aires, it's one big university, one big public university. That's really, it's the university. There's other small universities, but it has multiple campuses throughout. So it would be like the faculty of humanities would have its own kind of campus across town. There's the faculty of exact sciences. And those were the two faculties where this intervention took place. They were coordinated. They began at the same time. And they meant that the police sort of gathered outside of the building, told the students that they needed to leave the premise. The students said no, they refused, because university autonomy in Argentina was a sort of the product of a long-fought battle in the early part of the century, meaning that the federal police were not legally allowed to enter. The police then sort of entered the premise with tear gas and began to pull students out of the building. As you can see from the images, this was a violent process. A lot of students and faculty recall the night as La Noche de los Bastones Largos, meaning the night of the long sticks, because of the batons that police would use on them. I don't know if you can see any of the batons in the above picture, but students reported that they were made to walk between two lines as the police used the batons on them. So this marked a real turning point in the beginning of Onganía's rule. In the photographs like this, these are just from like a kind of tabloid newspaper. The photographs really sent shockwaves through Argentina. So large groups that had kind of supported Onganía, or at least supported some kind of military intervention, suddenly realized that this was not what they had expected. And when the 5 faculties tried to reopen, students organized again and prepared to meet the police. They continued to clash with the police for the next month. And so on September 7th, students in Cordoba met the police in the street. 24-year-old Santiago Pompilon joined 4,000 other students to march through the streets of Cordoba. This is the capital city of a northwestern province, also known as Cordoba. They rallied against this kind of interference that had not only happened in Buenos Aires, but also in Cordoba. Police responded, as before, with tear gas canisters, assault vehicles, and they forced the students to flee away from the main artery. So they forced them to flee away from Avenida Colón. And during the chaotic aftermath, some witnesses saw several police shoot Pompilon in the head. Official reports suggested that the police discovered him already grievously injured. He was transported to the hospital, where he lived for 5 more days before succumbing to his injury. So almost immediately after Pompilon was shot, and so while he still lay in a coma, he became a symbol for students protesting police and military aggression. His dual identity as both a university student and as a union worker helped to draw together these 2 parts of the political left in Argentina, the 2 most important parts of the active political left. Acts of homage to his memory transformed into big rallies that united the students and workers against the laws and the policies that had suspended their rights. And the symbolism of figures like Santiago Pompilon and the shared experience of risking bodily harm bolstered the only political alliance that was powerful enough to really challenge the military's rule. Students and their allies in Buenos Aires began to propose homages to Santiago Pompilon. The influential Argentine University Federation, the Intercentros, which was sort of a union of different groups at the university, and the Humanist League, which was also an active student party, planned a march of silence in Buenos Aires. It was set to begin on the evening of 7:30 on September 13th. The march proceeded despite its prohibition. So because the injured Pompilon was taken to the Hospital Clínicas in Cordoba, the students planned their march to begin at the Hospital Clínicas in Buenos Aires as a sort of reflection of the cityscape. However, police flooded the plaza, and the march started a bit later and a bit farther away from their original site. They were not able to arrive at their unspecified final destination. Usually it would be a march, but they always knew that they would be intercepted. And police released tear gas, and protesters fled or began to retaliate. They burned 2 cars during the clash. In this protest, students attempted a pilgrimage to the site of political importance, mirroring in Buenos Aires the protests in Cordoba. Students drew from the characteristics that they valued in Pompilon. His name invoked the brutality of police against vulnerable student bodies, and it combined worker and student in one identity as it recalled the importance of putting one's own body on the line. On October 7th, the month after the anniversary of the assassination, so this marked the shooting rather than his actual death, the Federation of University Students, the Intercentros, and the Humanist League again called for a complete strike of all activities. In Buenos Aires, the faculties of philosophy and letters, so the humanities faculty, exact sciences, economic sciences, and architecture all went on strike. These students planned a march beginning at the plaza in front of the Congress building, which was a site of protests often in Buenos Aires. However, given the strong police control of the space, students were unable to carry out the planned demonstration. The police still found pretexts to detain 15 students, and whereas this planned march on October 7th tried to occupy resident space, the confrontation with the military is what actually defined the anniversary march. They were expecting to sort of reenact the same kind of conflict with the police and military that had injured Pompilon in the first place. So Pompilon's, oh no, that didn't really come up. Pompilon's symbolism in 1966 deepened into an ongoing cooperation between students and workers by 1969. Ongoing strikes against several provinces, around several provinces over the month of May, not only identified specific grievances, but also called attention to how the military government failed to address working class and student concerns. Police met demonstrations with lethal violence. On May 15th, they killed a University of Corrientes student named Juan Jose Cabral. 2 days later, they killed Adolfo Bello in Rosario, which is another province to the north of Buenos Aires. And then during a march honoring Adolfo Bello, they killed the student Luis Norberto Blanco, also in Rosario. So within the span of basically a week and a half, there was 3 more martyrs, as they were called, joining in company with Pampilón. So it became this growing list of people that were recognized as being emblematic and as being symbols of the university and worker movement. So in Cordoba, students and factions of the workers planned their own demonstration to challenge the recent incidents of violence. Representatives of each group, the students and the workers, negotiated their diverse interests, but they drew on the connections that were forged in these earlier marches for Santiago Pampilón. They also sort of shared the symbology of the worker and student coming together in Pampilón, and his intersecting identities allowed the groups to bridge divisions, for example, the socioeconomic divisions between working class union members and the largely middle class students. On May 29th, in May 29th, 1969, demonstrations began with 4 union groups marching from different quadrants of the city. They began to meet in the center, and their numbers started to grow. As the crowd moved down Cordoba's largest street, Colón here, the police, quote-unquote, panicked and opened fire. That's from a contemporary article. The bullets killed, sorry, when I cropped the images, it kind of is showing a different part of the image than I intended. But the police killed a young man named Máximo Mena. It injured several other protesters. This moment proved to be a turning point in the Cordobazo. Before the policemen killed Mena, this was kind of understood to be a normal routine demonstration. This was something that students and workers had done frequently in the interim period between 66 and 69. However, when Mena fell, the march gained intensity and the police suddenly turned and fled. They were unsure how to respond, and historian James Brennan describes the transformation in the rally. Quote, "From this point on, the protest lost its organization and became a spontaneous popular rebellion," end quote. The number of participants exploded. Middle-class residents of the city who rarely went out into the street and protested started to join in. They offered material and personal support to those in the street. So a lot of people that participated in this remember like housewives offering them oranges or apples to sustain them, or throwing down crates that could be used to form a blockade in the middle of the street by burning them. So this became a sort of citywide rebellion. During the demonstrations, protesters recognized Pampilón's legacy as they approached Avenida Colón. They began to chant, a Colón, que ahora le toca a Pampilón. So it rhymes in Spanish, and that means to Colón, where it's now Pampilón's turn, sort of to claim retribution in some way. This chant made explicit the act of pilgrimage that defined Pampilón as martyr for students and militants alike. These riots, which were known as the Cordobazo, ended when the army troops finally entered the city, sort of days later. The troops occupied Barrio Clínicas, so the area around the hospital where Pampilón had died, which was also the student residence area. And however, Mena's death resonated long after the troops, who were actually commanded by future military president Agustín Alejandro Lanusse, who we'll talk about in a moment, subdued the city days later. So alongside Pampilón, Mena became a symbol for the excesses of repression under Ongania's regime. For students and workers, rallying in his memory offered a concrete way to voice opposition to the dictatorial regime. The mythologization of Mena and Pampilón relied on what critical theorist Michael Rothberg has termed multidirectional memory. So it's an idea that memory is, quote-unquote, subject to ongoing negotiation, cross-referencing, and borrowing. So they were borrowing between the two periods. In 1966, Pampilón's resonance for both unions and university groups rested on his dual identity as worker and student protester. After the Cordobazo, his name joined in Mena's in chants and flyers, and commemorations began to regard Pampilón as a symbol of student sacrifice and Mena as a symbol of the worker sacrifice. So they took on these divergent roles. Understanding Pamplon's identity within the idea of the multidirectional memory does not imply a loss or erasure of Pamplon's dual identity, but rather it referenced the very unity between unions and students that generated the conflicts, the conditions for the Cordobazo. On June 29th, union members and university students in Cordoba prepared to mark the first anniversary of Maximo Mena's death. They planned another March of Silence, organized primarily by the Mechanics and Allied Automobile Transport Union. So Cordoba is kind of an automobile production town. There's a lot of members of this union. It's very powerful there. They initially planned a religious act, but the priest in charge of the cemetery where Mena was interred, also where Pamplon was interred, forbade the religious nature of the act. The homage, composed mostly of students and union workers, instead proceeded to the third floor of the Pantheon where he lay at rest. Now, I kept reading this idea of the Pantheon, and I don't think it's something that's common to U.S. sort of burial rites, but I actually went to the cemetery to just try to understand what it is. It's this big building, basically. It looks like an apartment building with multiple floors with they call them nichos, so like little niches where the coffins are laid to rest. So it's just kind of walls of plaques, basically. So they planned to begin in the Pantheon, and they spoke about the late Mena. They echoed each other with harsh condemnations of the Onganía administration, and then they laid floral arrangements, so kind of enacting the vernacular of a funeral. They put up a plaque to honor him, and then 600 of those in attendance left the cemetery grounds and began their march. The police again intercepted them and threw tear gas at the marchers. You guys are kind of noticing a pattern here. Reporting in the regional newspaper, La Voz del Interior, noted the presence of federal police, water cannons, buses full of police forces, assault vehicles, and patrol cars, which, quote-unquote, brought order to the place. So this was the 1 month anniversary. Commemorations of the 1 year anniversary of Mena's death gave collective meaning. The union members again organized a march. Clarín reported, that's a daily newspaper, that the workers and students were able to carry out each act of homage. A member of the student Santiago Pamplon and of the worker Maximo Mena, so here we have the divide between them, without any inconvenience and in places where each lost his life. The police followed them at a prudent distance and did not impede the ceremonies. This police engagement, of course, was not spontaneous. It was very well planned. During the morning of May 29th, the lieutenant colonel in charge of the police had met with union leaders who vowed to maintain public order, so the responsibility was put on the organizers of the march. And he said that they could not be sanctioned, but he gave the police forces instructions to allow the commemorations to proceed. The act took place around 10:45 a.m. along Avenida Colón, where Santiago Pamplon had died, or had been shot, rather, and a column of approximately 1,500 people converged at the site where a young speaker evoked memory. They placed a flower arrangement. They sang the national anthem. And the Clarín reports that both the act on Colón and the march to the second site happened with, quote-unquote, the most absolute calm. Meanwhile, around 5,000 workers from several factories and students departed from the automobile plant where Pamplon had worked prior to his death, and they began walking towards the corner where Maximo Mena had been killed. Here they joined with the group arriving from Colón, so the site of Santiago Pamplon's death, or assassination, and several union leaders spoke severely about the leadership of the country. These acts of commemoration combined the repertoires of political protest and burial as they placed flowers and made these political pronouncements. So these acts fit within a broader repertoire of mourning and bore many of the same balances of private wakes or funerals. However, what distinguished the cases of Mena and Pamplon was the coordinated and public nature. After these two acts of homage, around noon, most of the demonstrators dispersed. About 1,000 people remained at the site, and the group began to pass through the streets with, quote-unquote, the intention of moving towards the central plaza. So now is when it starts to escalate a bit. The police forces stopped them at an intersection nearby. By this point, the police had instructions to dissolve the manifestation, and they used tear gas to disperse the procession. This produced a small scuffle as the workers and students began to throw rocks at the police forces. This kind of confrontation would be described in the press as a small scuffle, kind of signals what kind of political action meant in Argentina at this particular moment. So the clash lasted about an hour. and it at moments reached what the newspaper Clarín called a quote-unquote certain intensity. However, the calm returned completely to the city's climate, quote-unquote, after this confrontation. The newspaper explained, the climate of tension and nerves was slowly disappearing, more still when it became known that the incidents were provoked by a small minority of those in attendance. The police chief who had met with the leaders issued a statement to try to explain what had provoked this clash. He said that from the perspective of the police, the procession after the ceremonies was an act of disorder and justified the police use of tear gas. He explained that, quote unquote, as people dispersed, extremist sectors, which we have identified specifically, produced disorders and attacked the police, keeping watch around the area with the intention of disrupting public order. By the end of the confrontation, 170 people were detained, among them, quote unquote, workers and students. So this remains how they're identified in the press. So the combined acts of homage for Pampilón and Mena addressed both the student and worker participants in the ceremony and procession and asked them to put their bodies at risk in the same way that Pampilón and Mena, and included them in the production of this kind of collective memory shared between the two groups. And this is what gave their deaths meaning in some way. This is why they're recorded in history. To all of the audience, the participants in these acts argued that Pampilón and Mena's lives mattered and should be mourned. Indeed, the demonstrators' own shared identities were contingent on the possibility of recognizing that these lives have value even when the state attempted to interfere with the commemorative practices. So over the last 4 decades, so up to the current moment, Pampilón and Mena have been remembered in very different ways. The site of Pampilón's death, so that's basically in front of the cinema there, is unmarked. There's no, oh yeah, I can, that's where he died, is unmarked. I'm sorry, I keep saying death. The Hospital Clínicas at the bottom there is the site of the death. The site where he was shot is in front of the cinema. It doesn't bear any kind of permanent markings of this being the place where something happened. Around the corner, however, and I walked around this block probably 6 to 8 times just to make sure that I wasn't missing something. Around the corner, there is this marking of graffiti on the wall. And if we were to zoom in, we would see that there's one kind of graffiti that says Nunca Más, so using the discourses from the memory politics of the last military dictatorship to sort of mark this spot. There's another one that says ACAB, which I had to look up. In English, it means all coppers are bastards. So it's appropriating this kind of like anti-police rhetoric from the U.S. in order to mark this site as a place of police violence against students. And then there was one other marker here that said something about like judge and punish. So in contrast, the site of Maximo Mena's death is marked in both temporary and permanent ways. And what this kind of signals is that he is remembered as the sort of figure of the Cordobazo, this moment that really shifted the identity of this city. And it means that not only are there 3 different plaques that commemorate the place where he died, but also that the street sign has a piece of paper, just like plain paper, with handwritten Maximo Mena over the normal street name, which would be Arturo en Paz. So here someone has actively, within, I would say, the last month, participated in this kind of ongoing memory practice. I thought to myself when I took this photo, oh my gosh, what if somebody thinks that like, it was me just sticking this up here? No, I was actually shocked when I came upon this corner to see that. I knew that the plaques would be there, but I didn't know that people were still actively remembering him in this particular way. So the Cordobazo signaled a political shift. It signaled that Onganía had lost control in some way of the country. And the person who had taken control who had retaken control of Cordoba, Lanusse, became a more and more important military figure. He was seen as somewhat more rational, somewhat more moderate, and someone who wouldn't provoke this kind of uprising in many ways. Meanwhile, militancy, left-wing militancy specifically in Argentina, had started to grow. The Montoneros, which is one of the more well-known organizations, announced their sort of arrival on the scene with a really spectacular kidnapping of former president and general Pedro Aramburu. And they tried him and executed him in an act of quote-unquote revolutionary justice. The crime that they said that he had committed was both overthrowing Perón, Juan Domingo Perón in 1955, and also hiding the body of Perón's second wife, Evita Perón, who is probably the most well-known character in this history, in various locations. So they actually, after this event, they actually held on to his body as a sort of bargaining token to try to get Evita's body back. So there's a sudden shift after the Cordobazo to a different kind of politics, but that didn't mean that these acts of sort of protest and militancy abated in any way. So the next moment that we'll talk about is 1972 and 1973. And these are years that are marked by two massacres of both militants in the first case and political participants in the second case. So Maria Angelica Sabelli led a dual life as a student and as a revolutionary before she was imprisoned for her militancy, or more specifically, she was actually imprisoned for the possession of an assault rifle. The 23-year-old student studied math at the University of Buenos Aires, and in order to support herself, she taught math and Latin to local high schoolers. She also participated in a Peronist militant organization called the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias, or the Armed Revolutionary Forces. After her arrest on February 8th, 1972, military authorities sent Sabelli to the Rawson Penitentiary near Trelew in the southern province of Chubut. So this is extreme south of the country, not Patagonia, but very far south. At this prison, Sabelli shared space and formed community with militants from various revolutionary organizations, union leaders, and other political prisoners. The Rawson Penitentiary housed more than 200 of these people, both including common criminals and political prisoners, and it consolidated militants from across Argentina. The remote location isolated them from their families, but former inmates described the unity that grew between the militants from groups across the political left. They were housed together, Peronists from the Catholic-affiliated left-wing Peronist Montoneros, Marxist-Leninists of the FARC, which is what Sabelli was, and Marxist-Leninists from the Revolutionary Army of the People, which is known, the acronym is ERP, or ERP. They found common ground in their long struggle against the military dictatorships, and they also shared experiences of repression. So Rawson Penitentiary was not known as one of the sites of torture, but many had been tortured at other detention sites. So they had this sort of shared experience of physical harm in some ways. They overcame political differences. While only the Montoneros sought to bring about Perón's return or recognize any kind of religious influences, members of all three groups sought the end to Lanusé's dictatorship. So together, the prisoners planned an escape. On August 16, 1972, leaders of each of the three armed organizations designated a list of prisoners that they sort of planned to be the priority escapees. The total about 100 people, or half of the people at the penitentiary. They prepared for months. They improvised models, so they improvised like rifle models to practice with. They practiced gymnastics, so they could be able to move through the small passages in the prison. And they came up with codes to keep the prison guards sort of in the dark about their plans. So on August 16th, the prisoners overpowered the guards with relative ease. The only fatality occurred when a prisoner shot a guard who tried to alert the authorities. Some of the prisoners actually intended to stay. Perhaps they only had a short period left in their sentence. One of them was a union leader from Cordoba, actually, who felt as if, because so many of his union members were in prison, that he should be too, and kind of show solidarity. So the prisoners who intended to stay restrained the guards and let the others go. So the prisoners met one prearranged support vehicle that was intended to coordinate and transport the first group of prisoners to the airport. So there's a local airport in Trelew. 6 of the guerrillas, the leaders of the FARC, the Montoneros, and the ERP, were loaded into this car while the rest awaited for the additional support vehicles. However, there was a kind of miscommunication between the prisoners and the support vehicles. The support vehicle drivers thought that the operation had been called off and they didn't arrive. the escaped prisoners hurried to find other ways to arrive at the airport. They called taxis. And I forget if they got 2 or 3 taxis, but they kind of all piled into the taxis of very suspicious drivers. They arrived at the airport basically just as the plane had taken off. So they had to sort of come up with another plan. They decided to call a press conference in order to sort of gain support from the media to get their message out in the hopes that they would be allowed to return to prison without being transported to perhaps a military base or undergoing any kind of interrogation and likely torture. So they called this press conference. They took hostages, but not sort of aggressively. They're just kind of to ensure their safety. And they also asked for judges to accompany them if they were transported back to the prison. So this instance was the first time that any of the militants from these organizations had kind of spoken to the press, had spoken in public, and what they kept reiterating was their shared unity, how they had come to know each other's organizations in the penitentiary, and what they kept repeating was that they had a role in defending the pueblo, or the people. One of their chosen representatives explained, all the organizations that are here, the Montoneros, the FAR, the ERP, we are children of the pueblo. We are the children of the mobilizations of '69, so the Cordobazo. We are thus a part of the pueblo because of this, we have an obligation to safeguard its security. So by labeling themselves as the children of the mobilizations of '69, he and the other escaped prisoners worked to show that they were sort of part of the community, that they not only perpetuated and reshaped the collective memory of the uprising and associated it with this kind of militancy, the student and worker militancy in the process, but they also called attention to the larger economic and social violences that the military regimes enacted against the popular classes. So the standoff ended when the guerrillas agreed to return to prison, as long as the local judge accompanied them. However, the Navy officials prevented the judge from boarding the bus, and they were transported to the Almirante Czar Naval Base with no civilian witnesses or legal representation. They endured a week of interrogations by the Navy guards. In the early morning hours of August 22nd, 1972, the guards arrived to their cells ready to act violently. It's still unknown what really provoked them to do it on this day. The 3 survivors of the night noted that this was the first night that they had been allowed at first to sleep without interruption, and they were woken at 3 a.m. After commanding the prisoners out of their cells and telling them to form 2 lines, the guards began to taunt one of the prisoners. According to one of the survivors, Maria Antonia Berger, the guards marked and provoked Mariano Pujadas in an attempt to make him, quote-unquote, rebel and give them a reason. Berger recalls that they forced Pujadas to repeat, quote-unquote, I am not a guerrilla, I love the armed forces of my country, at length, so over and over. The Navy later claimed that Pujadas had wrestled a weapon away from a guard, and they defensively shot at the 19. While the popular Argentine press initially covered the story as told by the Navy, the bodies of the dead revealed this as a lie. Ricardo Rene Haider, Maria Antonia Berger, and Alberto Miguel Camps, the 3 survivors, later reported that the Navy guards systematically shot the others with a coup de grace at the back of the neck to ensure that there was no survivors. The days immediately following the massacre were filled with acts of commemoration over their physical remains. A wake was held for Maria Angelica Svelli, Eduardo Adolfo Capello, and Ana Villarreal de Santucho, who was the wife of the leader, the founder of the ERP, who was also 8 months pregnant, at the headquarters of the Perón's political party. This offered the first glimpse into the contentious process of burying and commemorating the dead of Trelew. The newspaper Clarín reported that by Wednesday, the day after the massacre, the military had, quote-unquote, shipped the cadavers of the dead extremists to the places where their relatives lived. By Wednesday evening, around 150 people had gathered around the Peronist headquarters waiting for the bodies to arrive, and family members and political groups began to make funeral arrangements. The 3 coffins reached the headquarters closed and welded shut. Initially, I thought that this was very odd, and so did many of the people. It turns out that you actually, in Argentina, often weld coffins shut if they're transported by plane. So that wasn't necessarily a red flag, but they decided that the attendees decided that they would like to basically see if autopsies had been performed on the militants. They mostly decided this because there weren't any death certificates that accompanied the bodies. So the lack of the autopsy is really what preoccupied those at the wake and the journalists covering it. In the presence of their lawyers, witnesses, and medical professionals, the mourners pried open Sibeli and Capello's caskets to view the bodies and confirm that no autopsies had been performed, where the procedure should have been, quote-unquote, a basic precaution in such cases, according to a bulletin published by the Buenos Aires Alliance for the Protection of Human Rights. The judge in charge of returning the bodies had not ordered it. As her family, friends, and political allies pried open Maria Angelica's Sibeli's casket, they found wounds that evidenced a deliberate and brutal violence. Her neck showed bruises as if she had been choked, and her entire occipital bone had been destroyed with a gunshot. Even without medical interpretation, her family could see that what the damage to her body meant. The same bulletin described the nape of her neck as destroyed, which indicated that she had received the coup de gracia that Haider, Berger, and Kamps mentioned in their testimonies. Coverage in a leftist magazine also mentioned that her body showed signs of violent blows and a shot to the nape of the neck without any exit wound. The mourners found 16 gunshot wounds in Capello's body, including on the nape of the neck, the same evidence of blows, and gasoline or oil stains. Even after their deaths, the bodies testified to the military's brutality and refused to serve as instruments in their sort of claim to order and sovereignty. Villarreal de Santucho's casket arrived later, and before the mourners could open it to display her remains, especially recall that she had been 8 months pregnant, so it would have been graphic, the police actually arrived at the headquarters of the Peronist Party, ready to disperse the gathering violently and to secure the caskets. A shoreline tank, which is apparently a British-made assault vehicle, broke through the iron gate that was guarding the headquarters. The police launched tear gas and forced their way through the crowd violently as they tried to reach the coffins. Outside of the magazine, around 3,000 people faced off with the police cavalry, so they also brought horses. The magazine Primera Plana, reporting on the confrontation, commented, quote-unquote, not Christians, the horses trampled once and again over the flower wreaths. This is sort of an odd religious reference here. The commentary points to how the police and their steeds refused to see the humanity of those that they attacked. The police on horseback yelled obscenities at the crowd, quote-unquote, completely uncontrolled. The 3,000 mourners gathered at the Peronist headquarters regrouped and suddenly made a front against the police cavalry, putting their own bodies on the line to protect the caskets and prevent the police from taking back the remains that showed the military's brutality. They sang, "Oh, we swear with glory to die." The phrase, a line from Argentina's national anthem, both hearkened to the language of glory and death that we'll see in some of the commemorations of the quote-unquote Martyrs of Trelew, and it claimed the patriotism against the forces of the military government, so it sort of claimed patriotic legitimacy against the military. The editorial in this edition of Primera Plana offered some reflections on military government's claim to sovereignty. Commenting on the military's recent censorship of the magazine, in an issue developed in a minute, the editors wrote, "The place where these rules come from must be the pueblo for their mandate to be legitimate." Primera Plana's assertion that in this conflict the only legitimate rule of law came from the people contextualizes this kind of invocation of the patriotic national anthem. So the police eventually overpowered the mourners at the gates and took the caskets. They buried Villarreal de Santucho in the cemetery in Boulogne, which is sort of at the north of the city, or outside of the city, and the 2 other militants in the large Chacarita cemetery, which is kind of like the normal cemetery of the city. As the same bulletin described, the Human Rights Bulletin, the family members could not accompany the remains as the burial took place without adhering to any of the legal requirements and without a death certificate. Preventing the funeral interrupted the reenactment of the previous commemorative marches and the collective mourning process. So the magazine that was describing these kinds of confrontation with the military was not a left-leaning magazine. It was not a sort of a militant magazine. There was plenty of these. This was a sort of middle-class, widely read, popular culture. It would be like a Newsweek, basically. And they took the bold step of actually printing an image. This is the Almirante Zad military base. And if you can see, oh, I can do this. Somebody wrote on the image the names of the 3 organizations from which the militants had come. So this is the ERP, the ERP, this is the Montoneros, and this is the FAR. And if you recall from the earlier discussion of what happened after Ongani's rise to the presidency, it was actually illegal to print these emblems. It was illegal to mark these emblems in a public space. And so the editors of Primera Plana knew what they were doing, and they saw this sort of attack on the families of the militants as barbaric enough that they chose to sort of take whatever kind of retribution came. Leftist publications actually acknowledged that Primera Plana had taken a significant risk to do this, and the military, of course, reacted swiftly. They could not control this magazine; it had already been distributed, but they took all of the magazines from the next edition that had come out. They even went to sort of press stands in the street and recuperated those. However, they were not successful in actually getting all of the magazines because some of them had been shipped to the U.S. As part of the sort of international distribution patterns and exist at U.S. libraries. The next edition that they knew was going to be sequestered, basically, only had on its front cover, it was completely blank except for the law that which they knew that they had broken, basically. So it was a way of showing that they had meant to sanction the military in some way. So we can see that there's starting to become a broader shift against the military. We can see that the military is losing its public support from the middle classes that had generally supported it from the more conservative factions of Argentina. So we're going to see some other sort of commemorations of Trelew. The trope of listing the names repeated in the printed homages by the left-wing groups, it metaphorically drew together ideological distinct armed organizations, so people from the 3 organizations that had been represented among the dead. And this flyer appeared less than a few months after the Trelew massacre. So this is actually undated. The only way that I was able to figure out kind of a range date was that many of the organizations were very short-lived. So by that, it was within probably 3 months after the massacre in Trelew. So what we have here is multiple organizations from across the ideological left joined together under the name Argentine Political Youth to recognize the deaths. So some of these are Peronist, some of them are radical, and given the disparate ideological influences, this advertisement, so this would have been published in a newspaper, included little text that might shake this sort of precarious unity between the groups. They only said the title, the shot homeland. They only said present to signal that these were the people that were still sort of it's reflecting the sort of public call that you would make in a march, like when people call out presente, like that the living bodies are still inhabiting the grieved bodies, and it drew together the mourners in an act of collective memory. And they only have this one line: the Argentine youth pays homage to all of its comrades fallen in the struggle for liberation. So this was broad enough to signal inclusion of all of the organizations that are represented here. And it suggested, well, that they might have had variety in their ideologies, that all of the quote-unquote Argentine political youths shared the same goal of fighting against the repression of the military. So other acts of homage focused on how the living would inhabit the lives of the dead by taking up arms in their memory. In 1972, so later this year, or later the year of the massacre, the Marxist-Leninist group Argentine Liberation Front, so FAL is the acronym there, responded with a poster of the three silhouettes fallen and the fourth raising his hands in defiantly. The document invoked the politically powerful phrase that circulated among left-wing organizations, which is ni olvido ni perdón, so neither forgetting nor pardon, and added here punishment to the killers, to the assassins. Alongside the drawing of the fourth person rising from the ground, the text read, "From each of the exploited a combatant, from each fist a rifle." So the military Oh, this is also just another illustration from the same organization, calling up this idea that they are present and that we will take up the arms that have been laid down because of the military violence. So the Treilou massacres shook the military's hold on the government, and they began to bow to public pressure to hold elections. By the time of the March 1973 elections, in which the former president Juan Domingo Perón, by the time his personal delegate, because they instituted a residency requirement, so you had to be in Argentina to run for office. So his personal delegate, Hector J. Campora, assumed the presidency. One of the ERP factions had assumed 22nd of August as their sort of consign to designate their group. This, of course, reflects back on the anniversary of the massacre. At the end of the following month, so in April, the group claimed responsibility for the assassination of Hermes Quijada, who was one of the naval officers that was in charge of the base. And this was, I believe, from September of the same year. Before the elections that brought Perón to power, the group issued a statement which reads, as you see, glory to the fallen in Treilou, and it asserted that the quote-unquote fallen patriots in Treilou offer their lives for the pueblo without any hesitation, and they accused the now democratically elected legislators of vacillating in their judgment of the perpetrators of the massacre. So the document here closes with the idea that the spilled blood won't be negotiated. Other documents from these left-wing groups, you can see the sort of variety of different flyers that they produced, really went with the idea of the heroes, that these were heroes of the movement. Before we see that Mena and Pampilón were really represented as martyrs, and now we have this idea of heroes being introduced. Sometimes they are described as martyrs and heroes in some way. So these are two. This is a faction of the PRT. So all these groups kind of split at various times, and the Juventud Guevarista, which is a Marxist-Leninist group. And then these were extremely widely circulated flyers, introduced the idea of the image as a way of commemorating those who had died. So we see again and again, it's not just the list of names that are used as a kind of commemoration and the signaling of they are present, but I suspect that it might have been because of improvements in printing technology, but they continue to print their images over and over after this particular moment. And here we have another example. So these repeated invocations of the Treilou massacre contributed to the political polarization during the period of transition between Lanusse and his military government and the beginning of Perón's third presidential term, obviously not consecutive. While students and workers invoked their predecessors' heroism and martyrdom to claim their own lives mattered and challenge Argentina's political order during periods of political change, the students and workers and militants in 72 and 73 used these qualities to justify their own claims to power and through increasingly violent militancy. So on the morning of June 20th, 1973, Peronists from across Argentina, literally from every corner of Argentina, began to converge on the highway that led to the airport, that led to the international airport in Buenos Aires. They moved in cars, buses, on foot. There was factions of the Peronist youth, the Montoneros, the FARC. They all kind of jostled for space near the stage to demonstrate loyalty to Perón, who is about to return. Major highways around the airport were shut down to accommodate the pedestrians who were walking to the site, and there was even special buses and train services to help shuttle people to the points of concentration nearby. Reports indicated that 3 to 4 million Peronists made their way to the gathering to welcome their leader back to Argentina. Perón had been in exile for 18 years, so it had been a very long time since they had seen their professed leader. Members of the political organizations identified themselves with different colored armbands. Together with their large banners, these armbands allowed them to move through the crowd and still sort of maintain their group together. The Peronist Youth, so this was one of the well-known organizations, especially during Perón's long exile, it was a left-wing group of obviously young Peronists. They wore blue armbands. And then there was this new group calling themselves the Peronist Union Youth, who wore green armbands. Despite the similarity in their names, they had two completely different origins. The Peronist youth had grown up as part of this sort of practice of militancy during the exile. The Peronist Union youth was entirely the creation of a right-wing union leader, Jose Ignacio Rucci. No record of it exists before the gathering at Ezeiza, and the group's presence served to sort of counter the perceived numerical and political influence of the Peronist youth. There are so many banners around the stage here that the master of ceremonies, Leonardo Fabio, who's kind of like a pop singer, asked the groups to lower them so that photographs could record the true mass gathering of the event for quote-unquote all the world to see. Fabio asked again after only a few of the banners came down, and within a moment there was shots into the crowd, basically. The gunfire lasted for about an hour. After the shootout, which was ostensibly between the representatives of the Peronist Union Youth, so the new kind of upstart group, and quote-unquote unspecified shooters perched in the trees around the highway, 13 people were dead, 380 people were injured, and some seriously injured. Responsibility for the attack soon fell on the right-wing organizers of the event. So these were the union leaders, the quote-unquote bureaucrats of the movement, which is what the left wing called them. It was an insult, kind of. And initially it seemed that the organizers had failed to provide the requisite security, or they erred in giving responsibility to this new group, the Peronist Union Youth. However, it soon became clear that the organizers themselves actually had a role to play. Multiple witness accounts claimed to have seen ambulances coordinated by the organizing committee loaded with weapons and brought to the site of the event days before, and accounts of torture of left-wing Peronists at the Ezeiza International Hotel, so the hotel near the airport, corroborated to the press by Leonardo Fabio, the pop singer, after the shooting, supported the perception that this had been a coordinated and planned assault on the left wings of Peronism. As Peronists looked over the photographs of the gunmen on the stage immediately after the assault, so here you can see that one of them is actually holding a rifle. This was widely circulated. And obviously this is a poorer quality than what you would have had access to if you were a contemporary photographer. They identified people as being particularly known individuals on the right wings of Peronism. So they widely condemned this sort of act by the right-wing Peronists, and this forever fractured Peronism between a left-wing sort of wing and the right-wing union-based forces that were growing closer and closer to Peron himself. Well, the victims of the Trelew massacre were commemorated by name and face. The political left discussed Ezeiza in terms of their most recent example, Trelew. This conflation between the two incidents of violence drew a direct line between the exclusion from politics that they had experienced under Ongania's rule and the exclusion from politics that they had experienced in this new Peronism. Whereas the Trelew massacre had happened clandestinely in a space controlled by the armed forces, millions of people had witnessed Ezeiza. So this massacre foreclosed the possibility for cooperation between the left-wing and the right-wing Peronists, and commemorations reiterated their refusal to cooperate. The process of commemoration, compounded by mourning deaths and confusing intersections between power and force, shifted the terms of commemoration from the recognition of specific individuals to sort of calls for vengeance or refusal to forget or forgive that didn't even identify specific individuals. So soon after the Ezeiza massacre, the Argentine Liberation Front, of which we've seen documents before, made a call for action among revolutionary organizations as they exercised, quote-unquote, popular justice against the enemies of the pueblo. So this leaflet is from 1973, and you can see it's kind of titled with this blood red imagery here that really calls your attention. Under that title, the text reads, "The assassinated patria and the injured pueblo so that's the assassinated homeland and the injured people, sort of the collective people, demand justice for the assassination of their best children. The reverse side of the pamphlet also called for vengeance and warns against forgiveness, announcing, quote unquote, to pardon is to cheat, to forget is to betray. In this construction of commemoration and vengeance, the FAL and its associated group, the ELN, which was sort of group that was brought into it, positioned itself as a defender against the degradation of Patria and the Pueblo, and they expressed responsibility for reclaiming self-respect for both. So again, invoking the anniversary of the Treillu massacre, the FAL released another leaflet calling for demonstration on August 22nd, and again, they repeat this kind of imagery. The Montoneros did the same, again linking Ezeiza to the blood that had been lost in Treillu, and calling for not only justice, but also not forgetting, so kind of active memorialization process. So I wanted to show, I've highlighted here the different places that are being noted in this kind of group commemoration. So we see the names in blue of the students that were killed, Cabral, Blanco, Pampilon. The Montoneros who had participated in the attack against Aramburu are in red. The ones in yellow are those killed at Treillu, and the ones in orange are those that were killed at Ezeiza. Some of these names are not identifiable in the history. They've been sort of lost, but it sort of gives you an idea about how this list just kept getting longer in some ways. So in 1974, shortly after he was elected, Perón died in office and Isabel assumed the presidency. She oversaw 2 years of just disastrous economic policy, and she really started to lose control of the government. This sort of instability preceded the March 24th, 1966 military coup. And as I mentioned before, this was sort of known as a moment that was unlike any other, and it created a different kind of memory politics. Because we're kind of getting to the end here, I want to sort of move quickly through the kind of memory politics that were initiated. So the memory politics that really became important during the military dictatorship were the memory politics of the state in some ways. And so here we again see the same use of these like close-up images that are supposed to cite the militants in some way. But instead of being the sort of commemorative practices that we saw at Treillu with Maria Angelica Savelli, we see now that these are being used as wanted posters. This particular young person, she was a high school student, well, she was at a normal school, so a teaching school. She put a bomb underneath the bed of the chief of the police, who also happened to be somebody that she had befriended at school in order to gain access to their home. So she was considered the worst of the worst because she had betrayed this kind of middle-class lifestyle that she had access to, and she had also sort of betrayed the ideas about parenthood by sort of attacking the representative father, the chief of the police. And we see this was the young man that she engaged in a shootout with, who represented the sort of best of the nation by this point. He was a conscript in the military. Because they were both 20 years old when they shot at each other and ended up killing each other, they were sort of representative of the working class and the middle class as being in conflict in some way. This is actually a better image so if we recall from before in the presentation, we had this same image of the wanted poster sort of being a precursor of the imagery that we see here. So in this image, we actually see that the names of the people that have been captured are sort of written over, and they're marked as dead. The only one who survived is from this group. The only one surviving was I'm sorry, they're all. There's another poster in which Firmenich also is, but this sort of signals the power of the state to control the images and to control the guerrillas. So returning to this idea of the 3 moments of of memory politics, we see that there's a significant transition in the use of photographs and the use of naming policies. Whereas before, this was a way to commemorate, to claim community. We see that by the early years of the military dictatorship, this has been transformed into a way to identify the specter of militancy that continues to justify, or that continued to justify the existence of the military in the first place. We see that the possession of the images sometimes stands in for the possession of the body of the militant, and sort of signals the military's power to name that had before been the purview of their peers. And so, when I was thinking about how to present this, I've been thinking a lot about what when these kinds of naming activities come up, when these kinds of calling present or using photographs come up, and it tends to be when there's a sentiment of state violence. They don't come up in a vigil after a tragedy. They come up when there's a perpetrator involved. And the idea is to claim recognition in some way for the lives that have been taken unjustly. And I think that the three moments of the Argentine case can offer us a lot of, can offer a sort of framework for understanding what the different variables can be and what the different combinations can be. So here in the in the case of the 43 missing Mexican students, we see the same kind of repertoires of naming, marching, of displaying faces. There's videos of the protests in which they actually count out to 43 as a way of symbolizing the loss of the 43 students in southern Mexico. There were 43 students who had gone to teach in a village, and they were abducted by likely the local mayor and his wife. And then I also have been thinking about this in the constructions of Black Lives Matter over the last 2 years. And what signaled it to me most was the idea of saying her name, because it is very reminiscent of the idea of repeating the names of the disappeared, or repeating the names of the martyrs of Trelew in public as a way of enacting a political response against a sentiment of state repression in some way. And obviously, in these cases, there's significant difference between the Argentine context and Mexico or U.S. of the contemporary moment. But I think that it helps us to understand political movements to place them in some kind of historical context. So I really look forward to any questions that you might have, and I hope that this has provoked some questions. And I would be happy to discuss also more any particular moments, especially in the last part. So thanks so much. Yes. Let's get the microphone from Sana.
I don't know if what I'm going to say is worth recording, but when Perón returned for his third term, could you say something about how successful this third administration was, and also when Isabella became president? I know she was vice president. She was his wife. Evita tried to become at one point vice president, but was opposed by the army and so on. But anyway, if you could say something about Isabella's administration and exactly what was going on there. Who was really in charge? I know she didn't have a lot of qualifications for running a country. Could you just say something about Perón's final administration, and if any of this turmoil was addressed by him in an effective way, and exactly what was going on with Isabella?
Sure, I can do that. So
I think she did her best to hold things together, but
so she's a very fascinating character. Yeah. So Evita had actually in 1950, it must have been 1951, had actually sort of made gestures at being Perón's running mate for the next election. However, her health failed. So it's not that she it's known as the act of renunciation, when she stood up and said, "No, I won't accept this. I only live to serve my husband, and I'm a wife and a mother," all that. And so it was actually because of her failing health. She was dead, I think it was within a year after that. So she died from an advanced, sometimes it's reported as uterine cancer, sometimes it's reported as cervical cancer. And so she actually became the first sort of symbolic martyr. So in my larger work, she's actually sort of the model for a lot of these commemorations in some way. She's remembered. She didn't die in a violent way, but she's remembered for the renunciation as an act of sacrifice in some way. And then, so Perón met his third wife. She was Argentine, but he met her really while he was in exile. She was trained as a dancer. She had been touring with a company. I believe they met in Panama. He was in exile for a little while in Panama and then moved to spend more of his exile in Madrid. And she had, first of all, she didn't have any political experience. Second of all, she had spent most of the previous 2 decades outside of the country. And so she had come back once or twice. She had been received by representatives of the Metallurgic Union, which is a powerful union, but only for short periods. And so when Perón and Isabel returned in 1973, they pretty much knew of Argentina what the representatives in Argentina had told them. Most of these representatives were coming from the large, powerful, bureaucratic unions. Sometimes there was leftist representatives that went to Madrid as well, but Perón had grown more authoritarian in his time in Franco Spain, basically. And he had grown farther to the right. So his ties with these groups strengthened. He expelled a group of the Montoneros and other left-wing militants from the Plaza de Mayo on May 1st. So May 1st was supposed to be this big celebration. You know, it's International Workers' Day. The left-wing groups went to the plaza all excited, and he condemned them. He called them beardless, meaning like you're young, you don't know anything. And he told them to leave. And they turned around. They called present first. They did their whole round of who was dead and called out the names as present in the style. And then they turned around and they marched out. And this was the ultimate rupture. And so Isabel not only began her presidency without experience, without a lot of knowledge of Argentina, she began it with a really fractured Peronism. And she relied very heavily on this kind of shady figure known as Lopez Rega, Jose Lopez Rega, who is, he believed in esoteric rituals. He tried to channel Evita's spirit into Isabel. This part of Argentine history is so weird that you couldn't make it up. Yeah, and he was put in charge of the Ministry of Social Welfare, which under Perón had grown into an important part of the government and had reemerged as a really important part of the new Peronist administration. And so he was put in charge of that, and on the side, he started a paramilitary group known as the AAA. And the AAA's job, it was the Alianza Anticomunista Argentina, so the anti-communist, the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance. And they began the sort of practices of disappearance that we would see intensify during the military dictatorship that began in '76. So this created even more fractures between the left wing and the right wing. And so in this moment you had a growing instability because of the growing militancy. And then Isabel often spent large periods of time outside the country or away from the office. So I don't know if I can make a judgment on whether she tried her best or not, but she was clearly ill-equipped and not well advised. Yeah.
That's good enough.
Yeah. Okay.
So, 2 quick questions. So I'm interested. So I like this, particularly the last sort of vignette you took us through of the way that the military sort of incorporated some of these tropes into their own messages. Mm-hmm. But I'm interested in those, since memory is a sort of contested thing, whether those particular moments you were highlighting, those particular massacres, or mm-hmm. whether the way that they are represented by the other side, so are they also memorialized by the right or by others, yeah. But with very different language and very different mm-hmm. images, or so I'm interested in sort of how those particular historical memories mm-hmm. are contested by both sides. And then second, the idea of sort of the recitation or the representation of names and faces of victims as a sort of particular as a particular response to state violence. Mm-hmm. I was thinking of sort of 2 prominent examples in the U.S. case. I'm not sure they exactly fit, and so one of your thoughts. So one was the Vietnam Memorial, as you sort of mentioned. Maybe that fits, maybe that doesn't. But the other is the sort of annual reading of the names of the 9/11 victims, right? Which is very similar in spirit to what you seem to be describing, but I don't know if it is exactly the same kind of feelings that are being evoked there.
Great. Those are two great questions. So the military uses some of so the military in Argentina is now not the same military that existed then. However, there still exists some groups in the military that consider this a moment of, as I mentioned earlier, a dirty war. It was a conflict, sort of a more legitimate conflict between the left-wing groups and the right-wing military governments. And they see the people, because there was a lot of people in the military that were killed by these militant organizations, and they see them as kind of martyrs. They were also sacrificed. And so there are sort of, there are basically websites and memorial to them that do have the same kind of listing of names and similar practices in some ways. So they definitely are remembered in similar ways, but with very different sort of ideological presences. The exception, I think, where there's a more unified sort of collective memory about something would be Cordoba. And so because Cordoba has remained a city where unions are very powerful and where the automobile industry is a big sort of driving economic force, there's a much bigger sense in Cordoba that there's a shared collective memory of the Cordobazo that probably crosses, or maybe doesn't cross socioeconomic and ideological lines, but there's more ideological coherency. And so throughout Cordoba, you see memorials basically that mark the different places of the Cordobazo in the city. And so in that sense, I think that there are some events that have a more streamlined memory practice around them. In the case of the young militant and the conscript that she killed, it's interesting because one of the accounts in a magazine says, quote unquote, something about, well, it's not quote unquote, but it's something about how history will only remember Ana Maria Gonzalez because she committed this horrible act, and they will forget Felix Dimitri. And I always thought that was interesting because it's this pre-existing nod towards the future memories that would be taking place. And in some cases, that's correct. Ana Maria Gonzalez's sort of crimes are remembered because of how shocking they were to a country. But still, in that magazine, they're sort of performing this kind of commemorative practice. And then your other question was about the listing of names. I think that that's a great sort of parallel. It shows how the sort of nitty-gritty of what makes something different in a way. Because I think that the practice of reciting names, you see it, I think, yes, with the 9/11 memorialization. You also see it, I think, in Israel. They put the name. There's one day where they put the names of all of the dead members of the military on the television screen, and it lasts for so many hours. So we see this sort of recitation of names happening in a lot of places where there's mass deaths or countable deaths in some way. However, I think what is different in this case, and perhaps different with the say her name as well, is the idea of calling present. So asking the living bodies that are present to actually embody the bodies that were dead, the bodies that were lost. And so I think that's what makes it kind of a militant memorialization rather than just a vigil in some way, which has a different kind of purpose. Yeah.
One more question.
All right. Thank you for your presentation. So in the late 1960s, there were a lot of protest movements, student protest movements around the world, both, especially in Western and Eastern Europe as well. And I was wondering if the repertoire of sort of memorial practices that you were discussing in Argentina emulated or maybe was borrowed from some of these other places. I'm thinking particularly about the 1968 protest movement.
Yeah. So in a lot of the historiography, Cordoba is considered just kind of like a later version. Because it's so close in proximity because there was significant student participation. However, the scholarship that sort of gets into the details of the Cordobazo shows how it's a slightly different case. And this is one of the reasons why I like the case of Santiago Pampilón so much, because it shows that this was the product of years of collaboration between workers and students. And the reason why it's a bit different from like the case of Mexico City in '68 or Prague or Paris is because of the activity of the union members, which had this kind of massive infrastructure already, and which sort of combined with the students, but it wasn't exactly a student-led protest. So they're definitely using similar repertoires. They look very similar from the exterior, but the union presence, the really strong union presence, I think, is a slightly different part of it. Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah.
So invite to come and check. We got to officially end, but we can certainly have one-on-one conversations with her afterwards. So let's
One quick question, maybe?
I have to defer to Ellen here.
Yeah, so let me bring it to official close, but we'll invite to have the continued discussions at 5:30. That's our commitment to those who come, but I certainly don't want to cut off conversations, allow you to come and chat with her afterwards.
Thank you so much
Please
for
join
coming.
me in
I really appreciate it.